good afternoon, good evening to this event today. We're waiting for a couple of minutes while we're admitting other participants to the event. I would like to welcome all of you to this event today, which is addressing the linkages between climate change and violence against women. Our conversation today contributes to the overall conversations and the discussions, the deliberations that are taking place during, I would say, a rather groundbreaking Commission on the Status of Women session that examines the priority theme, achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. This discussion also reflects the work and priorities of generation equality and action coalitions, especially the ones on gender-based violence and feminist action for climate justice. We know by now that violence against women and girls and climate change are two of the most pressing global emergencies and sustainable development challenges of our time. Violence against women and girls is one of the most widespread, pervasive human rights violations worldwide. We know the statistics and the most recent ones that such violence affects more than 1 in 3 women throughout their lifetime. And we know that it has been exacerbated during COVID. And at the same time, climate change is threatening our planet's sustainability with devastating impacts. And it affects women and girls, of course, disproportionately, and especially the most marginalized ones. And we're having emerging evidence which clearly shows that climate change itself exacerbates different forms of violence against women and girls. And despite the significant and interrelated impact of both climate change and gender-based violence on the lives of women and girls, policy and programmatic approaches seldom address this intersection. And that's why today we will have the pleasure of learning from an esteemed panel of global experts on the ways in which climate change and its related impacts contribute to violence against women and girls, and in turn, how violence against women and girls on itself and as a barrier can impact environmentally sustainable solutions and which can definitely help mitigate and reverse the impacts of climate change. We framed the discussion today in 2 segments. The first segment will be addressing and framing the context of the discussion today, draw the linkages between climate change and gender-based violence against women and girls, and examine the impacts of climate change on particular groups of women. I would like to start this discussion with Ms. Kate Ovren, who's the Senior Gender Program Manager at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, which is also a leader of the Action Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice. Kate is a women's rights and gender equality specialist with 20 years of experience working exactly at this unique intersection of gender and environment issues. She has worked across different levels, global, regional, national, and local levels on policies, programming, and practices that aim to remove gender gaps and improve equality outcomes in tandem with environmental outcomes. So, Kate, if I can turn to you with the first question. We know that at the recent COP26 Climate Action Summit, countries reaffirmed several Paris Agreement goals. And also we have the Glasgow Climate Pact, which calls on all countries to present stronger national action plans by 2022. These global agreements definitely recognize the devastating impact of climate change on the environment, livelihoods, and increased inequalities. Gender-based violence against women and girls represents, as we know, one of the most severe forms of such discrimination and inequality for women and girls. Can you please help us framing a little bit these interlinkages? And what exactly are these interlinkages between climate change and gender-based violence against women and girls? And what kind of recommendations can we give for how climate policies and programs can take steps to address these linkages? Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends and esteemed delegates and colleagues. First, I want to start by thanking UN Women and all of the co-organizing allies of this important event, which IUCN is very proud to partner on, and to all of you for joining us today. Around the world, as climate change is impacting safety, natural resources, and livelihoods, as it changes our development and conservation strategies, our priorities and investments, gender-based violence is on the rise. And the links are clear, varied, and plentiful. In our research at IUCN and in our work with diverse partners around the world, we've seen evidence from every corner of the globe that together paints a rather startling picture of what gender-based violence and climate linkages are, both a violation of human rights and both a barrier to a healthy, peaceful, and resilient planet. So a couple of examples. In post-weather related disaster contexts, the stress, tensions, and livelihood insecurity triggered by conditions of scarcity intersect with pervasive, persistent gender inequality to create prime conditions for GBV to flourish. After 2 tropical cyclones in Vanuatu, for example, new reported cases of domestic violence spiked 300%, while here in the United States, after Hurricane Katrina, GBV experienced by women more than tripled. Conditions for sexual exploitation and trafficking also increase. For example, after Typhoon Haiyan in Thailand nearly a decade ago, trafficking increased up to 30%. But these dynamics extend beyond the immediacy of disaster contexts to the longer-term impacts of a changing climate as well. We know, for example, that the rates of domestic and intimate partner violence increased during prolonged droughts in the agricultural communities of Australia, while child marriage is increasingly seen as a survival strategy, as much in the disaster-prone areas of coastal Bangladesh as in the extended drought periods in Ethiopia, threatening to roll back decades of progress. Meanwhile, from Latin America to South Asia to Canada, evidence shows us again and again that gender-based violence restricts the work, silences the voices, and manipulates the agency and safety of women environmental human rights defenders fighting for their rights, their territories, and for climate justice. Okay, so what can we do about this? Well, as climate policymakers, as practitioners, as funders, as researchers, we can listen and then we can act. Because enabling policy frameworks, program strategies, and cross-sector partnerships and rights-based investments are nothing short of urgent. The impacts of a changing climate are upon us, but we still, and we will always, have some control and bear responsibility for how we respond. The CSW, we can point to many gaps, but also many opportunities to bridge them. At international level, for example, parties and stakeholders to the Biodiversity Convention, the sort of sister convention to that on climate change, are right now considering a new gender plan of action that includes specific attention to tackling GBV in relation to natural resource access and control. This could be a game changer if it's agreed, and could and should inform climate policies, programming, and financing as well. At national level, we know nearly 80% of countries' national plans now include gender considerations in some way, a huge leap up from 40% about 5 years ago. But According to our own research, only 6 countries make the connections in any way to gender-based violence and climate links. For countries to realize their commitments to gender equality and human rights, more concerted attention to these links is necessary, paired with cross-sector cooperation and dedicated investment. At programming level, we can improve our gender-responsive strategies with tailored tools, data, and capacity building to help sectoral teams recognize, understand, and be empowered to mitigate, prevent, and respond to GBV, including especially in partnership with experts. And in practice, we can work differently every day, including through building communities of cross-sectoral learning and support. This is exactly what we're trying to do at IUCN with diverse members and partners in the dedicated work of the Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center, where we're raising awareness, advocating for improved policies and programming, and providing tailored technical support and tools to projects around the world. I want to offer a special word of thanks here, especially to our partners at USAID, from whom we'll hear more later on this panel, for bringing this effort, really this dream, to life. During this CSW66, the spotlight is on, but one of the most important things we can do here is find ways to ensure gender-based violence and climate linkages do not remain in the shadows once these critical 2 weeks are over. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate, for framing our discussion today in such a comprehensive way. And if I can emphasize especially the way that you said that we have growing evidence, definitely that shows the clear impact of climate change on violence against women and girls, but also something that we don't often think about. It's the slow climate change and the degradation of the environment that creates exactly these stressors that you described to communities, and which definitely exacerbates the risk for violence against women and girls. Definitely a lot of gaps, only 6 countries addressing the linkages, and many, many opportunities that hopefully will be addressed effectively during the CSW66 session. So after you have been framed that so well, maybe we can get to our second panelist, Mrs. Reem Al-Salem, who's the new special rapporteur on violence against women, its causes and consequences, that the UN Human Rights Council appointed her for a 3-year tenure in July 2021. Ms. Al-Salem is an independent consultant for different issues such as the rights of refugees and migrants, transitional justice, and humanitarian response. So, Ms. Al-Salem, if I can turn to you right now with a very specific question that your mandate has been dealing with for some time now, about particular groups of women that they do face intersecting forms of discrimination. And we know through evidence and the work that we do on the ground that these groups of women, they do face exacerbated risks of violence and different impact on them. Can you please tell us how these groups of women who face these different intersecting forms of discrimination, how does the climate change affect them, and how do they experience violence? Thank you, Reem, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Calliope. And I would like to join Kate in thanking you and thanking UN Women for convening this important discussion. And actually, the question you ask is a very important and good question. And let me start off here by saying that we actually only have anecdotal and indirect data on this. As you know, having age and gender disaggregated data following a disaster was already a challenge prior to our collective realization about the immense problem of climate crisis. And as you also had said maybe in the beginning, that the conversation around this has focused so far very much on the relationship between gender equality and climate change, and of course on the important need for the participation of women in responding to the climate crisis, but not so much on the issue of gender-based violence. Now, the little anecdotal evidence that we have comes mainly from what we know about the increased risk and experience of GBV in humanitarian settings. So following large-scale natural disasters and conflict. And this relationship has been already recognized by CSW in its recommendation 37 back in 2018, which was titled Gender-Related Dimensions of Disaster Risk Reduction in the Context of Climate Change. And this recommendation remains very much relevant today. Now, it's precisely because of the lack of data and the examination of GBV in the context of the climate crisis that I'm actually dedicating my first report at the UN General Assembly this year to this issue. And while I'm painfully aware that we might still not have the data by then, I hope that the report will encourage states and other actors to start thinking about this more concertedly, and particularly on how to remedy the gap that we have on data and the need for a more nuanced understanding. Now, besides that, as I said, there is data from research and studies on related issues to GBV. So, for example, one research had found that men generally had a larger carbon footprint than women. So by deduction, the authors argued that gender-blind climate action risks perpetuating the existing gender-segregated labor market and the gender pay. And so attempts to change to lower carbon lifestyle may disproportionately affect women in terms of pay, effort, and time spent. And if we were to ask why there is no data collected on this relationship between climate change and GBV, I think the answer could very well lie in another study, which, though limited in scope, is very telling. And this research comes from data that looked at the representation of women in government in Nordic countries and the proportion of men to women in government positions that aim at tackling the climate crisis. And they found that women were hugely underrepresented in these positions. So in a way, no wonder then that the responses are not very geared towards understanding the gendered impact. Because there is a gendered imbalance in policymaking and governance spaces that address climate change. There was also research conducted in 2 rural wetland communities of Uganda on people who rely on agriculture for livelihoods. And these communities were experiencing changing weather patterns, heavier rainfalls, prolonged droughts, higher temperatures, increased crop failures, and so on. Now, this food insecurity and drought meant or means that women must go further to find resources, putting them at risk of violence and sexual assault, both on the journey, and also increased the risk of dropout of school and violence from men for being too tired to complete domestic duties. But for me, the most sort of authoritative piece of data that we have on this relationship comes from the latest IPCC report, which deals with impacts, adaptations, and vulnerabilities, and which has repeatedly pointed to the different groups of women that are the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And the report highlights in particular Indigenous women, older women, women that belong to minority groups. So there you very clearly see the intersectionality, right? And how different profiles and identities and conditions can exacerbate the already precarious situation of women and certainly some groups of women. And the IPCC report recognizes that many groups of women are amongst the most vulnerable to climate change and are the most affected. And we also know, for example, that there will be an increase in climate change related migration as climate risks heighten, and the distinction also between forced and voluntary movements will be increasingly blurred. And as that happens, more women will be forced to live in places that lack safety, that lack privacy, and poor and marginalized women have less adaptive capacities due to fewer resources and less access to law, policy, and decision making. And their research on sub-Saharan Africa showed that climate change reduces the mobility for women and increases it for men. And curiously, it was the opposite actually for the research that was conducted in South Asia. So finally, also, the other piece of evidence I would like to point out to is the evidence that climate change disproportionately affects the health of women. So there was evidence gathered from 130 climate and health studies, and that showed that 68% conclude that women are more severely affected than men. So whereas men suffer more from infectious disease, women are more likely to suffer death, injury, and food insecurity as a result of extreme weather. So in conclusion, we do need to obviously devise rights-based responses to ensure the safety of women, get a better understanding of these intersecting factors that affect their vulnerability to climate change, and address the social and gendered consequences of this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Al-Salem. I think definitely the data gap is very clear for the interlinkages between climate change and violence against women and girls, but you have already referred to very important evidence, emerging evidence that really demonstrates these linkages. And I think just one point that I think it will give us a nice transition to the next panelist about how when women are underrepresented in positions where they can have influence on governmental policies, in our case, environmental and climate change policies, these tend to be gender blind. And so we recognize how important it is having women being represented, having a critical mass in order to influence these policies. But very often, when we have women in movements and in governments influencing these policies, they do face a lot of harassment and violence themselves. And we see how violence can be an impediment on its own in order to effect some change, sustainable results. So I think we have the perfect transition there. And I already see a very active question and answers box there with very interesting questions and reflections. So if we can move to our next panelist, Ms. Melania Chiponda, who's the policy advocacy lead at Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. Ms. Chiponda is an ecofeminist climate and development justice advocate. She has worked in the African region with indigenous groups and working class women on climate and energy justice. So very important experience to shed light into some of the issues that we are discussing today. So Ms. Chiponda, over to you. We know that women and girls globally continue to play a very significant role in the climate action movement. And their activism is, however, often met with violence and harassment. And we've seen now, including on social media and online, becoming more prevalent forms of violence. Can you please give us some suggestions? What actions can governments and other stakeholders take to address violence and harassment faced by women and girls working in support of the climate action agenda and to address the impacts of climate change? So Melania, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think as has been already indicated that violence against women, it manifests as physical because of some underlying structural injustices. And with regards to climate change, there is intensification of that violence. And also because of the current climate crisis, women are occupying the front line to defend lands, to defend territories, to defend their livelihoods. And why that is so in most cases, it is because women, particularly in Africa, are less mobile. After climate-induced disasters, women are unable, they find it very difficult because of the care work burden and the household burden, and also because their livelihoods are extremely tied to the land. And therefore they end up being tied to their homes, and that makes them unable to be mobile or to adjust. And one of the things which is often not talked about is the increase in cultural and religious fundamentalism during climate-induced disasters, when communities seek to make meaning out of what has caused a cyclone, out of what is causing droughts, what is causing hunger. And mostly women human rights defenders become the target because of the cultural beliefs, religious beliefs. The system or the patriarchal system is uncomfortable with women stand up to challenge injustice. And therefore this makes women more vulnerable to attacks, physical attacks, attacks on the media. Right now, when we look at the trend, a lot of the frustrations that people are facing during the COVID pandemic, during the climate crisis, women are being attacked both on the social media and as well physically in their homes and everywhere. And we see also the absence of women in a lot of decision-making processes. And why that is so, it is because mostly women make decisions. They have to decide and make choices whether I have to go and attend the CSW in New York, or I have to look after the baby. I need to make sure that the children eat. And this is the majority of the women in Africa. Looking at how the food systems in Africa are run by women, a lot of the food that we consume in Africa is produced by peasant women, indigenous women, and therefore the decision to participate even at local level, women are extremely constrained. We do have laws which say that there is no discrimination. Women can come and participate, can come and take positions of power, of making decisions. But when we look at women's backgrounds, women have to make those tough decisions in terms of what will happen, how should we redistribute the care work that women are carrying so that we open spaces for women to be able to participate. And currently also looking at this twin crisis that we are currently living in, we have the COVID pandemic. We also have the climate crisis that we are living in. And for women to be able to travel to New York, that on its own is a constraint. People look at the process of acquiring a visa, the process of vaccinations, the process of even accommodation costs and everything. That those are serious constraints, even if the financial resources could be available. But our personal lives as women are extremely political in the sense that they reflect this patriarchal system that we are living, which puts those barriers. So what should be done? How do we move forward? The moving forward is something that can be addressed through policy, but there should be also deliberate actions to make sure that the spaces are safe for women. In a lot of, I have worked with women who were affected by the cyclone Idai in Zimbabwe and Mozambique, and a lot of the violence is pushed to the periphery when people talk about the need to rebuild. The institutions talk about the need to revive the infrastructure that was destroyed by the cyclones, by the floods, about restoration of houses, of schools, but there is not much talk about the restoration of women's lives so that they can go back, they can bounce back to become active members of the same community, of their countries, of their communities. Nothing is being said. And the traumas that women face, they are taken for taken for granted as the cost that women should carry on their own, because this has been a disaster. And therefore we see that as this violence against women intensifies when there are disasters, there is also focus on law enforcement, not to focus on the violence against women, but to focus on other things, because then that violence becomes normal, that violence is taken as unimportant. So what I'm saying is, as much as we have laws which are protecting policy frameworks, which are supporting the participation of women, there should be some also spaces for women to be able to voice their concerns, to also to identify and say, this should be done this way for that to work for women. I think that is often the missing link, that when policies are made, apart from the issue of exclusion, the voices of women are silent, and also even the reviewing of such policies, women's voices continue to be missing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melania. Such important points you'll be raising, and how in during crisis, how we're having women, when they are active agents to change the situation and participate in recovery in the aftermath of crisis, very often they are challenging stereotypes and traditional norms, and therefore they face violence and harassment. And I think you raised another very important element in this discussion, the care work and the care burden, which definitely got exacerbated during COVID, as we know, and how that affects and all the other constraints women have in order to effectively participate in these processes. So thank you very much, our three panelists, for this important discussion. And we have already, as I said before, a very active chat box and question and answers, and a lot of experts that they contribute already with their own perspectives to this discussion. So if we can take a few minutes for the panelists to have some additional reflections beyond what they have already shared with us. We've seen a couple of questions, for example, how to close the gap between disaster risk reduction work and humanitarian peace and development, given that violence against women is the connecting factor across these areas of work. We heard already from Melania how to protect women environmental human rights defenders. We heard a lot already, but if you have any additional reflections, any other panelists, and what is the evidence of linkages between GBV in the household, domestic intimate partner violence, and climate change? We heard a little bit about the stressors that such crises create, but I would like to open the floor to the three panelists, rather for some interaction and some additional thoughts and reflections, if there are any. Would anyone have any additional reflections?
I can add just a couple of thoughts. Thank you, and thank you so much for all of these comments coming in. Actually, I wish we could hear more from some of the folks on the line who are chatting in the box. There are some really important points being made. I saw one question directed to me asking for a source for data, and I put it in the chat box, although maybe it didn't make it to everyone. Maybe the host can also help me add that. I was referring to data in an analysis that we actually did and published last year, examining the extent to which countries are considering gender considerations in their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, which are the national climate plans that countries are preparing. They must submit and they're invited to submit updates this year as their contribution to the Paris Agreement. So we will be looking at those revised plans this year to see if now also thinking about this CSW that's focused so importantly on these intersections, is this changing how countries are thinking about connections, but also really preparing programming and priorities around these intersections? There's also a couple of comments here about climate finance. And I think it's really important to underscore that right now, including in with due respect to the most recent IPCC report that just came out, ambition is fundamental, and meeting existing climate finance commitments is fundamental to protecting the rights and lives of women and girls in all their diversity. I don't think that we have exceptional promising practice yet about how climate finance specifically can address gender-based violence links. However, I think in the next part of this panel, we're going to hear some promising practices from leaders who are addressing through environment and development strategies. And I just want to thank again all the speakers and the commenters here in the chat box. These are really wonderful points.
Thank you so much, Kate, for these additional reflections. And Reem, over to you.
Yeah, thank you really to the participants for the very good questions. And I just wanted to highlight the question from Farhana, and that speaks also to the financing. One of the issues I would like to explore in my report is precisely where funds for the prevention response to the climate crisis, to disaster risk mitigation, etc., will come from. And the question is, will it channel away or remove funds from programs like social protection, other regular programs that are already underfunded, targeting victims of GBV? To what extent will states think about the needs of victims of violence and think about additional victims of violence that may be created in the future? So these are all things that I don't have the answer to. And there was also a question about the vulnerability of women with disabilities. And I think this is a very good question. And as far as I've seen now from the input we've received to the call for input to the report, I have not received specific information on this, but I'd like to make a plea that in the next 2 weeks until the call closes, if any organization would like to send some reflections on that, that would be very much welcomed.
Thank you so much, Reem. And maybe we can put your call for this report in the chat box, so in the question and answers, in order to make sure that the participants have access to it, because it will be a very important and groundbreaking report in the General Assembly this year. We have a couple of minutes left. So I see Melania that has some additional thoughts, and thank you, the panelists, for addressing and checking the question and answers and addressing some of the points raised. Melania, over to you.
Thank you very much. So there is a question on the role of corporations in all this. I think from working with activists across the region, and also myself being a land defender, climate justice activist, I have seen how, the issue of droughts, for example, and in areas where communities are hosting corporations, particularly within the extractives, that there is a really need for corporations to be taken to account for how they contribute to the vulnerabilities of women who are living the climate crisis. We have seen how, because of droughts and water shortages, how some corporations in the mining sector also grab rivers or take control of rivers, which are sources of water for the communities, making water extremely unavailable to the women, and women having to walk very long distances to have water for household use. This exposes women to sexual assaults. And this also sometimes, because in some communities, water is actually being sold, and sometimes employees from corporations are actually accused of sextortion, that we allow you to get water in exchange for sex. And this is something that is often unspoken because of how women feel their dignity has been taken away. But these are crimes which are taking place within areas affected by the droughts. And one last thing is the issue of loss and damage, that we are appealing for loss and damage not only to be appropriated in monetary terms, because when we start talking about loss and damage as economic and non-economic, the work done by women is often considered non-economic, yet it is work that sustains lives and also sustains communities. And therefore, those contributions that women are making, they are not quantified and they are not considered part of the loss and damage. So I think there is need for policies to also take into consideration what is currently considered non-economic losses. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melania, for this very important additional points. Such an interesting discussion, including in the chat box and the question and answers. I think in this first segment, our panelists have framed the issues in a very coherent and comprehensive way. So we can move now to the next segment. After we framed the issues and the context, what can governments do, and what are some good practices that we see in place addressing the interlinkages and some of the gaps that our panelists in the first segment raised? So we have a round of other esteemed panelists being with us. And I would like to start first with the Honorable Paul Sparkop, who's the governor of Port Moresby, the capital city of Papua New Guinea. And also he is a member of the National Parliament. And Honorable Sparkop, he has provided extraordinary leadership to the Port Moresby Safe City program in markets and transport as a founding city program in the UN Women Global Initiative on Safe Cities and Safe Public Spaces, which as a program achieved many transformative results in the lives of women and girls and continues to inspire so many cities around the world. So, Your Honorable, we would like to hear from you now, and especially from the perspective of a local government, of how does the city of Port Moresby address violence against women and girls, and especially in public spaces? And how is the Port Moresby Safe City and Safe Market program linked with climate change or disaster risk reduction initiatives? The floor is yours. Can you hear us? Maybe you're muted. Yes, you're muted. Okay.
All right.
You're on.
Hello.
Hello.
All right. Thank you. Firstly, let me thank you for the privilege and opportunity to participate in this forum. I'm very pleased that Port Moresby, we can contribute to this global dialogue on linking GVB with climate change, and what action we can take in order to mitigate it. But in respect of the specific question about Port Moresby, how we dealing with spaces, public spaces that can make it safe for women and girls. As you know, with UN Women, we have been working on, our focus in terms of making the cities safe for women and girls has been in the area of market. And in the markets, this is basically historically has been a space mainly for women. And so the vendors in the markets all around the city, and there are quite a number of markets in the city, in our city, about 80% or 90% of them are women. And a lot of times, on a daily basis, they face all forms of gender-based violence, from harassment to actual violence to, stealing and so on and so forth. So for the last perhaps 5 or so years, we have been working on this project where we trying to turn the situation around, but working in so many different type of means to change the space, make it safe for women and girls. The physical infrastructure, we have to change it, because a lot of markets, like just getting to the bathroom is very challenging, can be subject to harassment and actual violence against women and girls. So we have to change the physical design of the market. We also had to do, gender sensitizing as well, both for women and men especially, so that they can get more respect for women and girls, recognizing that this is generally a space for women and girls, and for men to be there, they must, be gender sensitized. We also work on financial literacy to get women to, the vendors to take control of the earnings from the market, because most times, they are just making the money, and the husband or the partner or the boyfriend comes around and steal the money, use it on something else. So we try to work on getting them to be able to bank the money instantly in the markets. So there's no opportunity for the men to come and, steal the money of the vendors, the women vendors. So a lot of, different approaches that we are working on in order to create this safe space. And the whole idea is to create this space, which is predominantly a women's space, start out to make it safe, and then we, roll it out into like public transport and into, the community generally, into other public spaces. And we work on, in terms of other public space, we got other programs as well. Like we got a active city program where we get the women and girls, young men and young boys to, participate in different activities, mainly physical activities like walking and yoga program and kickboxing and dancing and acrobat. And so we get young people to work together so they can start to respect each other, seeing each other as partners, and not the traditional ways in which there is a culture of discrimination and suppression and inferiority or that type of a prevalence of attitude between men and women. So it's not been easy for us in Port Moresby, because in the rest of the country we have a high rate of gender-based violence, but we have to start somewhere, and we have come a long way in terms of making the market safe. Now, one of our main markets, we have completely built a new market in partnership with the development partners like New Zealand government and UN Women, of course. So since we opened it about 2 years ago, the level of in terms of reported harassment and gender-based violence generally has dropped, in a big way. Again, we have still to get the data so that we can make a comparison, but it has dropped markedly, so, we'll start to keep on rolling this out into the other markets in our city and hopefully to go around the country. But if I could also just, make the connection to the subject at the end, which is to link GBV to the climate emergency or climate change. In PNG, although we don't have the data and the evidence yet to make the link, but the link is obvious for us because in Papua New Guinea traditionally, historically, it's the women who create wealth. They, are the farmers. They do the livestock and raise chicken and raise wealth generally, and they go to the market to earn income. They run, the trade store that belongs to the families. So, the impact of climate change, will naturally and in a direct way have an impact on women and girls of our country. So, but this is good that we are having this dialogue so that we can start to make the link and design action plan that can mitigate. But in PNG, it's a serious problem already, climate change. We have the first climate refugee, or among the first climate refugee in PNG. We have to relocate these people, and that becomes a big problem for women and girls. How are they going to do farm and care for the families? Whether they will go to an environment where, like from the island, they can go fishing again, and how do they go and fish in somebody else's tribal area? So a lot of connection there that we need to make the link and get the data and the evidence quickly so that we can design program that can mitigate the consequence of climate change, increasing of gender-based violence, because it will increase gender-based violence. Because when they can't farm, they can provide food, or the food becomes scarce, so it cannot grow in the normal sort of cycle. They cannot plant and harvest on time. It becomes a big problem. Yeah, and the women and girls will cope the consequence of that type of situation.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah.
That was such an important intervention, Your Honourable, and I think clearly addressing vulnerabilities of women through the Safe City, Safe Market model, where you addressed it in a rather comprehensive way through infrastructures and also addressing economic vulnerabilities of women, accompanied with changing social norms in the communities for men and boys as well. I think it presents a very good example and very successful case study that has been replicated in other parts of the world. So we really thank you about that, and you will have the opportunity to have some additional reflections. So after we heard from you, we would like to move to our next panelist, Ms. Emily Esplen, who leads the Ending Violence team in the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and which brings together the department work on tackling violence against women and girls, child protection and child marriage. Prior to this, Emily led the gender equality team at the OECD Development Directorate and has previously worked on women's rights, policy, advocacy, research in civil society and research institute. Mrs. Esplen, it's such a pleasure having you in this panel. And if I can address a question to you, and very relevant to the COP26 last year that the United Kingdom hosted so successfully, and the government of UK pledged the commitment to tackle climate change while addressing the inequalities that make women and girls more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. What does the government of the United Kingdom do to realize this commitment also in relation to addressing violence against women and girls? So Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Calliope. It's such a pleasure to be part of a very rich discussion today. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. The UK is really proud to be co-leading the Action Coalition on Gender-Based Violence and to be actively engaging in the Coalition on Feminist Action for Climate Justice too. And we really welcome the opportunity today to bring together members of these two coalitions in dialogue along with experts, because we know that these issues are profoundly intertwined. In the UK, we remain committed to using our COP presidency to drive gender responsive climate action and finance in partnership with others. And we are determined to do more at this intersection of GBV and climate justice. I won't repeat what my fellow panelists have already said really powerfully about the interlinkages. We all know violence against women on our scale in all countries. The change can exacerbate what's already such a precarious situation for many. So using our leadership to advance the rights and freedoms of women and girls is a priority for the UK, and we're focused in particular on 3 areas of action. Firstly, and crucially, we are committed to championing women and girls' climate leadership and supporting their voice and agency, building their climate resilience through supporting women's rights activists and organisations on the front line. We know that, of course, as others have said, while women and girls are disproportionately impacted, they're also crucial leaders in climate action. And has also been mentioned, we are very concerned about both offline and online women environmental activists and human rights defenders experiencing gender-based violence as a tactic to intimidate and hinder their participation in climate action and movements. So in November, we announced a further $3 million to support women's rights activists and organisations on the front line of tackling gender-based violence through the UN Trust Fund and Violence Against Women. That brought our contribution up to $25 million. And we really welcome the work that the UN Trust Fund is doing at this nexus of climate justice and gender-based violence in countries such as Fiji, Honduras, to really invest in organisational resilience and recognise the critical role that women's rights organisations play as part of the preparedness and response system. We're also investing $45 million in a community resilience partnership to support local communities and grassroots women's groups in Asia and the Pacific to adapt to climate change, whilst also challenging gender inequalities. Secondly, we've heard today about the data gap. We're committed to investing in generating and supporting the use of quality policy relevant evidence to support more effective policy and practice around the prevention of gender-based violence. We launched our new 67 million What Works to Prevent Violence programme at the Generation Equality Forum last year. And this will be particularly investing in piloting and evaluating pioneering approaches to prevent GBV in some of the most difficult contexts, including in the context of climate crisis. And we'll also be looking particularly at questions around intersectionality, including, as others have raised, around particular vulnerabilities of women and girls with disabilities and how we prevent violence against those particularly at-risk groups. So we hope that that will be a contribution towards building the evidence base on what works as a global public good and really starting to seek solutions. And then thirdly, as COP26 president, the UK remains committed to prioritising the advancement of gender equality within our climate action and finance. At COP, we made clear our commitment to this goal, announcing 165 million in funding to ensure that gender equality and climate action go hand in hand. We have the framework that we need in the Gender Action Plan agreed at COP26 in Madrid. Now we need to really continue driving implementation and encouraging all countries to embed gender and GBV prevention and response in their climate action. We know that gender equality can't be a casualty of climate change, and this means it must cut across all of our efforts. So as our COP presidency continues and through our leadership of the Action Coalition on GBV, we are committed to continuing to amplify the voices of those whose views are often most marginalised or silenced. We want to be guided by women who are most effective, and I've learned a lot already from listening to those on this panel. And we want to continue to support change that's led from within affected communities and by affected communities. And I really look forward to hearing from the rest of the panel today and learning from others, and to continue to strengthen our partnerships, including between these two action coalitions, to tackle this urgent twin problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you for the extraordinary leadership, your personal leadership, and also the leadership of UK in these important areas of work, and for highlighting as well the work that the Action Coalitions do and the possibilities and the potential we have as a movement at the intersections of gender equality, GBV, and climate action. And the very important program, what works for prevention, and the second phase that we are all looking forward to launching in different regions. So I would like now to move to another panelist, Ms. Jamila Bijio, who serves as the Senior Coordinator for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment in the Office of the Administrator at the United States Agency for International Development. And prior to joining USAID, Ms. Bijio served as a Senior Fellow on Women and Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, working on the relationships between gender equality, national security, and global prosperity. She previously served as the Director for Human Rights and Gender on the White House National Security Council staff. And as such, she was a representative of this council on the White House Council on Women and Girls. So, Mrs. Bijio, over to you now. In order to hear from you about how USAID as a key leader in addressing GBV in the context of climate change got more engaged in this issue, and what is your approach to investing in solutions to address the issues across the nexus? And how is USAID and the US government using its policy frameworks, including your upcoming USAID climate strategy, to establish addressing GBV as a priority in its climate response? So, Mrs. Bijio, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you all today. And such a pleasure to hear all of the reflections of my fellow panelists on this critical issue of looking at the intersection of gender-based violence and the climate crisis. USAID is committed to addressing both of these issues, to addressing the climate crisis head-on, recognizing that it threatens progress toward development goals and exacerbates global inequities. We are also committed to addressing the shadow pandemic of gender-based violence around the world and creating a world in which women and girls in all of their intersecting identities are free from violence to be able to fully participate in society. When we look at the intersection of these issues, we recognize that climate change is sexist, that women and girls bear the brunt of climate change impacts due to laws, regulations, and gender norms that discriminate them. And as we've heard from my fellow panelists, that includes contributing to increases in gender-based violence. So for USAID, when we look at the need to address the intersection of climate change and gender-based violence, we have thought of and developed a strategy to be able to tap our full influence as a funder, as a thought leader, as a government partner to draw attention to this overlooked issue. It started in 2014. We partnered with IUCN, who I'm thrilled to be on the panel with today, and together we created the Agent Initiative, Advancing Gender in the Environment. It aims to ensure a sustainable and equitable future for all by recognizing women as agents of change and working to bridge gender equality gaps in a wide range of environmental sectors. This has included clean energy, fisheries, climate, conservation, and really looked at how can we together drive that work forward. After 5 years, so in 2019, based on the work and the feedback from partners, we together decided to prioritize efforts to focus on the relationship between gender-based violence and the environment. We've recognized that without data, funding, and information on how to address this nexus, that too little was being done. And that's a gap that was of concern that's been raised by local groups and leaders from feminist movements to climate movements, as we've been discussing today, that any barrier to local women and women-led groups from being able to contribute to the climate solutions. Those are barriers we need to collectively address, gender-based violence being one of them. So we started with the evidence gap. We commissioned a groundbreaking study in which IUCN documented and collated qualitative and quantitative research, case studies, key informant interviews, media reports, to really document all of the ways in which gender-based violence is used as a tool to reinforce existing privileges and power imbalances over access, use, and control of resources. We've heard more of those examples on today's panel and are thrilled that the study pulled that together. So we have it in one place and can look at how, when environmental threats occur, GBV increases, including sexual violence, intimate partner violence, forced prostitution, child early and forced marriage. So for those dedicated to addressing the climate crisis and all that it does and all the threats that it poses to humanity, the message is clear. Gender-based violence is a barrier to being able to enable women as climate change agents to help their communities and countries mitigate, adapt, and build resilience in the climate change effort. So first step was gathering the evidence. Next, what do we do with it? Driving forward more resources, more dedicated investments to addressing GBV in environment and climate programs. So in 2019, we launched what we called the Resilient, Inclusive, Sustainable Environments Challenge, the RISE Challenge, to address GBV in natural resource management. We funded IUCN to establish the Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center. We've awarded 9 grants so far to a wide range of countries, from Colombia to Fiji to Uganda and Vietnam, with the intent of taking what has worked in addressing gender-based violence in other sectors like education and global health and adapt it, test it, and adapt it to the environment sectors. So our grantees are working on GBV as it intersects with land rights, with REDD+, with sustainable farming, conservation, artisanal mining. We've set a goal of working with a wide range of partners. So the RISE Challenge works with large NGOs like Conservation International, Women for Women International, CARE, with research centers like the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, with regional leading organizations like the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies, as well as local organizations like UTSCHE, an Indigenous Peoples Group in Guatemala, and ASEFA, a women local-led Congolese organizations. If we are going to drive change in this sector, that's what we need. We need a full strategy that includes donors and international NGOs and local NGOs, research institutions, UN agencies, government partners at all levels, from mayors, as we've heard today, to governors, to heads of state and federal governments. And what we've seen through that kind of approach is a big impact. We've seen that the programs that we have funded have led to increases in agreement that men and women should have equal access to resources and opportunities. We've seen increases in understanding and awareness of how GBV intersects with the environment and with climate change. The GBV and Environment Linkages Center, as I noted, is providing technical assistance and capacity building to partners all over the world. Quickly, one example is some of the work that the Kenya Wildlife Conservancies Association is leading. They recognize that women need equal access and control over resources, that they need to be leaders in conservancy work, and that gender discrimination and gender norms was limiting their ability to do that. Women were reporting physical violence, verbal abuse, humiliation, and intimidation because of their involvement in conservancy and leadership. And men who supported women's leadership were also experiencing harassment. And that's where our Kenya partner took a gender-based violence model and a broader model, CARE International's social analysis and action model. And they adapted it and used it for the first time in the conservation and natural resource management sector. And through that, provided training and safe spaces for conservancy staff to identify and challenge harmful gender norms that were systematically excluding women from leadership roles. And in that way, helping to create safe, equitable, and inclusive governance around natural resources. And that's a critical model of what we're doing, again, of taking lessons learned of how we're approaching gender-based violence in other sectors, adapting it with local leadership, with technical expertise to climate and natural resource work in countries, at community levels, at national levels. This is a kind of approach that the US government is truly committed to continuing to pursue. We have centered attention to equity and inclusion in our climate strategy, including addressing gender-based violence, while our gender equality strategies and our strategies on GBV are also centering and recognizing climate and the environment as key areas in which we must work. We're dedicating more resources. Our administrator, Samantha Power, announced that at our at COP26, at our official USG side event, our climate future is female. We've also just announced that across our budget, we are doubling the work that we are doing on gender equality and women's empowerment. But we must do more collectively. We have received hundreds of RISE applications beyond what we are able to initially fund. Our USAID missions around the world are increasingly seeking technical guidance on how they can integrate attention to gender and GBV into their environmental programs. And I'm sure other donors are experiencing and seeing these opportunities and these gaps. So here's our call to action. To other donors, to other partners invested in this space, join us in addressing this challenge. In the next few months, the RISE Challenge will put out its next call for applications. And I hope together we can support more of this critical work of local communities addressing the intersection of GBV and the environment. And that together we can expand the global reach of IUCN's GBV and Environment Linkages Center, expand the research and the technical guidance on how to integrate GBV prevention, mitigation, and response into climate and environment strategies and programs. Truly, this is an incredible opportunity for us to come together to make a world where women and girls, men and boys are free of gender-based violence, recognizing that this strengthens their ability to fully contribute to climate solutions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ms. Bizio. Very important contributions. And last but not least, and we're getting a little bit over the allocated time, but we heard from different regions, and now we're moving to a very important region, the Caribbean region, which has been affected by climate change, and important voices from that region. So our next, last but not least panelist, Ms. Elizabeth Riley, who's the first female executive director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, and who has very valuable experience over 22 years in the areas of disaster risk management and environmental management. So, Ms. Riley, the last question for you, and if you could please share with us some experiences from the Caribbean region, especially recognizing the commitment of CARICOM member states in tackling climate change and gender-based violence. How do CARICOM member states and local organizations mainstream GBV prevention and response into disaster risk reduction and management efforts in the Caribbean region? So, Ms. Riley, the floor is yours. And thank you for waiting so patiently all this time.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And first, let me thank UN Women for the kind invitation. And it's really an honor to share the panel with such distinguished guests. So let me start by saying that gender matters. And it certainly matters in the context of the 20 small island states which participate in the CSW system. And there's a body of evidence that supports this. We know that women in the Caribbean face inequalities in many aspects of their lives. 2015 Caribbean Synthesis Report, for example, spoke to the higher incidence of burden of care, where women were the dominant providers of unpaid domestic work, accounting for 92% of such labor. We also have high percentages of female-headed households, higher unemployment amongst women, and more vulnerable employment, as we have seen coming through from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in the region and the disproportionate percentages of women who are employed in the tourism industry, for example. There are also lower wages, and these inequalities amplify the impacts on women of hazards. And it also has significant implications with respect to recovery. In addition, women and girls continue to be more at risk for gender-based violence, including as a result of displacement from hazard impacts. And we've seen that repeatedly across the region. From the side of climate change, the Caribbean is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change. And a 2020 State of the Caribbean Climate Report confirms that all climate parameters are changing in our region. This includes with respect to sea level rise, air and sea surface temperatures trending upwards. And we're anticipating that the region will be 17% drier by the end of the century. We also have evidence of record-breaking hurricane seasons, 2017, 2020, and the damage from those and losses from those events is quite significant. But I want to also say that in addition to the climate-related hazards, one of the things that we are very mindful of in the Caribbean is the very complex interactions that are happening between different types of hazards, including those that are climate related. And we certainly saw these types of scenarios playing out in Haiti last year with the earthquake, the COVID pandemic, and of course, the tropical cyclonic activities with coinciding at the same time, similarly for St. Vincent and the Grenadines and for Guyana. So what is CARICOM doing and what is CSW doing? So there are many areas I could speak to, but due to the limited time, I will touch on three. First, integration at the policy level. And within our region, our states are very much guided by the global agreements which treat with this issue of gender, including the CEDAW, the Beijing Platform for Action, where our states are already signatories. At the regional level, we have distilled the interpretation of these global mandates through various strategic and policy guidance documents, including the Regional CARICOM Gender Plan of Action, our own Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy 2014 to 2024. And we've also distilled it even at a deeper level with the integration of gender considerations into specific policy guidance documents prepared by the CSW Coordinating Unit, including our Model Comprehensive Disaster Management Policy, and our model legislation, for example, encourages expansion of governance arrangements to integrate gender and women's bureaus as well. The second area is that of capacity strengthening. And we're very clear that there's a need for a better understanding, but also a common understanding of gender. At the CSW Coordinating Unit, with the support of Global Affairs Canada, we have brought on board a gender specialist to our team. And the intent is really to strengthen our technical capacity to address gender equality issues through several avenues, through a strategic plan, through unit annual, as well as individual work plans at the agency. In the area of training, through our regional training center, we've engaged in a range of initiatives, including in collaboration with UN Women, which is a significant and valued partner of the CSW Coordinating Unit in our region. For our deployment teams, we've also collaborated with UN Women to undertake gender sensitization sessions for our surge support teams, which go out into the field in the aftermath of events, so that there's an awareness and also an integration of these considerations into how they do their work. And the third area is really related to tools, development of tools, but also application of globally accepted tools, including the UNDP document on the integration of gender into disaster risk management issues by small island states. We're working through the Spotlight Initiative, advancing integration of violence against women and girls, as well as family violence, into work that we're doing, and utilizing these tools also to measure progress through monitoring and evaluation and the articulation of appropriate indicators, because it's very critical for us to understand where we are in order to determine where we need to go. So in closing, just a couple of points here. I think one of the critical things for us in the Caribbean is really that need to strengthen the evidence base for decision-making. And as such, we're working significantly on improving data collection, which reflects gender considerations. We have also looked at the whole issue of psychosocial support and how we support populations as a whole, but specifically women and girls, given some of the observations I made about gender-based violence in the aftermath of events, and also how we can better leverage our social protection systems to give better coverage to vulnerable women and girls in the aftermath of events, and to treat with these considerations as we chart the recovery efforts, including through the Caribbean Resilient Recovery Facility, which has a specific gender lens in the application of the work that it does. So thanks very much for the opportunity, and back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Ms. Riley, for this really, really important reflections and experiences from the Caribbean region. And with this last intervention, I would like to thank all of you for participating in this important discussion. I think an important element here is how important it is to build systems and longer-term interventions to addressing gender-based violence against women and girls in the longer term, because we know that slow degradation of the environment and disasters related to climate change, they can increase violence against women and girls. So if we don't have the systems and the work already in place, we're going to face immense challenges. And also, it will be a very serious barrier for women to have access to processes and recovery efforts in the aftermath of disasters. I would also like to tell you that IUCN, together with UN Women, has just published a policy brief on the interlinkages between climate change and violence against women and girls. And we're going to share with all of you, having some important data that IUCN and other panelists have already shared. And we're looking forward to our ongoing partnership and collaboration. Thank you very much, all of you, and have a nice day, nice evening. Bye-bye.